Alright, today I have for you Epic History TV's History of Russia Part 3. I've already done parts 1 and 2 as well as the 1917 Russian Revolution video, so please go check those out. And let's just dive right into this one.
In the early 1700s, Peter the Great's reforms put Russia on the path to becoming a great European power. But it was his grandson's German wife, Catherine, who deposed her husband to become Empress of Russia, who oversaw the completion of that transformation. Like Peter, she too would be remembered as the Great. Catherine was a student and admirer of the French Enlightenment, and even corresponded with the French philosopher Voltaire. She reigned as an enlightened autocrat. Her power was unchecked, but she pursued ideals of reason, tolerance, and progress. Catherine became a great patron of the arts and learning. Schools and colleges were built. The Bolshoi Theatre was founded, as well as the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts, while her own magnificent collection of artwork now forms the basis of the world-famous Hermitage Museum. Catherine encouraged Europeans to move to Russia to share their expertise, and helped German migrants to settle in the Volga region, where they became known as Volga Germans. Their communities survived nearly 200 years, until, on Stalin's orders, they were deported east at the start of World War II. Catherine's reign also saw enormous territorial expansion. In the south, Russia defeated the Ottoman Empire, winning new lands and the fortresses of Azov and Kerch. But then Catherine faced a major peasant revolt, led by the renegade Cossack Yemelyan Pugachev. The rebels took many fortresses and towns and stormed the city of Kazan before they were finally defeated by the Russian army. Catherine then forcibly incorporated the Zaporozhian Cossacks into the Russian Empire and annexed the Crimean Khanate, a thorn in Russia's side for 300 years. Russia's new lands in the south were named Novorussia, New Russia. Sparsely populated, they were settled by Russian colonists under the supervision of Prince Potemkin, Catherine's advisor and lover. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, exhausted by war and at the mercy of its neighbors, was carved up in a series of partitions, with Russia taking the lion's share. Poland did not re-emerge as an independent nation until 1918. Russia inherited a large Jewish population from Poland, who Catherine decreed could live only in the so-called Pale of Settlement, and were excluded from most cities. In France, the French Revolution led to the execution of King Louis XVI. Catherine was horrified, and in the last years of her reign, completely turned her back on the liberal idealism of her youth. 3 years later, Catherine died, ending one of the most glorious reigns in Russian history. She was succeeded by her son, Paul, a man obsessed by military discipline and detail, and opposed to all his mother's works. Russia joined the coalition of European powers, fighting revolutionary France. Marshal Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest military commanders, won a series of victories against the French in northern Italy. But the wider war was a failure. Meanwhile, Paul's reforms had alienated Russia's army and nobility, and he was murdered in a palace coup. He was succeeded by his 23-year-old son Alexander, who shared his grandmother Catherine's vision for a more modern Russian state. His advisor, the brilliant Count Mikhail Speransky, reformed administration and finance. Yet the emperor refused to back his plans for a liberal constitution. Ultimately, it was war with France that would dominate Alexander's reign. France had a new emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, who inflicted a series of defeats on Russia and her allies at Austerlitz, Eylau, and Friedland. But at Tilsit in 1807, the two young emperors met and made an alliance. Russia attacked Sweden, annexing Finland, which became an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. But then, in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. At Borodino, French and Russian armies clashed in a gigantic battle, one of the bloodiest of the age. Napoleon emerged victorious, but the Russian army escaped intact. Napoleon occupied Moscow, which was destroyed by fire. And when Alexander refused to negotiate, the French army was forced to make a long retreat through the Russian winter and was annihilated. Napoleon had been dealt a mortal blow, and Russia, alongside Prussia, Austria, and Britain, then led the fight back, which ended in the capture of Paris and Napoleon's abdication. At the Congress of Vienna, as part of the spoils of war, Alexander became King of Poland. Then, with Austria and Prussia, he formed the Holy Alliance, with the aim of preventing further revolutions in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Balkans and Caucasus, Russia had been waging intermittent wars against the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and local tribes. The frontier had been pushed south to incorporate Bessarabia, Circassia, Chechnya, and much of modern Georgia, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. But the peoples of the Caucasus bitterly resisted Russian rule. Russia's attempt to impose its authority on the region led to the Caucasian War, a brutal conflict fought amongst the mountains and forests that would drag on for nearly 50 years. Alexander was succeeded by his brother Nicholas, a conservative and reactionary. But parts of Russian society had now developed an appetite for European-style liberalism, including certain army officers who'd seen other ways of doing things during the Napoleonic Wars. They saw Nicholas as an obstacle, and the new emperor's first challenge would be military revolt. Epic History TV relies on...
Yes, there's a few things. Catherine the Great is an interesting person because, she's not actually born of Russia. She's German, but she comes into Russia. She comes into power with all these liberal ideas, and she brings a lot of art and culture into Russia. But over the years, she becomes hardened, and I think a lot of that, was the ruling of Russia. Russia is a very difficult place for many rulers because it just incorporates so many different groups of people and so much territory that it can be hard and has so many enemies. I think she becomes hardened over time because by the end of it, she's rejecting a lot of her ideas that she had when she first came into power. And she does, whereas in the beginning, she's actually not really one for cracking down. She is later. She cracks down, and we see that with the annexation of Crimea after the Cossacks down there revolted and caused all that mayhem. She just responded by just taking them over and putting them under her thumb. which is a much more Russian move than it would have been a German move at that time. Just to expand and dominate over an enemy, because that's really what the Russians were doing at the time. They were finding, that they were beating out enemies and then just taking the land and dominating over it. It was, a more classical form of imperialism. It wasn't the going overseas and taking little countries type of imperialism, but it was more classical, the same way that the Romans and things had done. Which, going back to what I've said in previous videos, I mean, part of the heritage of the Russian culture does come from the Romans, comes from the Byzantines, so they do have that mindset in there. It's part of it, and they have the Vikings, which did a lot of the same type of thing, of just going in and taking enemies, and near the end, anyways, they would settle. And the Mongols were another influence on them. So, like I've said in earlier videos, you get this really interesting conglomeration of different cultures that influence what would become Russia, and you do see that leak through in their actions later on, like we see with the wars in the Caucasus and the taking over of the Crimea, and those are very Roman or Mongol-like moves that just simply go in and beat up the enemy and take that, or one rebels and so you respond by just taking all their land from them and putting them under your thumb so you can control them, make sure it doesn't happen again. That's something that the Romans would have done. That's something the Mongols may have done. They had other ways of dealing with dissent, but the Romans usually just went in and conquered whoever was sticking them in the side. The Vikings weren't too thrilled with that sort of behavior either. But again, they had a little more different way of dealing with it than just conquest. But yeah, so that's one point that I think Catherine the Great is a very interesting person, because she's not Russian, but I feel like she becomes Russian. So upbringing creates one thing, but her rule creates a whole other type of person. And she's very effective the entirety of her rule. She's one of the greatest leaders Russia's ever had. But her mentality and her way of ruling does change over time. I think a lot of that has to do with just trying to rule a country like Russia, where we do see that assassinations happen, coups happen, mass revolts happen. You have enemies on all sides, and you're trying to expand at the same time, while also trying to take a country that's not quite Eastern, not quite Western, and try to Westernize it and be more European, but also not lose some of the Eastern influences that you have that make you unique. It's a very complicated area to rule, especially for this time period, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries especially. 18th and 19th probably the most difficult. But yeah, so she was very interesting. Yeah, the other thing I bring up is, you have another ruler who's unpopular, alienates the army, and is overthrown, and somebody else takes over. That's, again, very common in Russian history. Assassinations and overthrowing people and all this are very common in Russian history, whereas we look at other countries and it's like it happens here and there, and we're like, oh wow, we look at the French Revolution, this mass overthrow of leadership, and then we look at like Russia, and it's like, well, this is, not quite to the same extreme, but it's more normal for unpopular leaders just to be tossed out and even executed or whatever. Whereas somewhere like, France, it never happened, so the tension built and built and built until the revolution happened. And Russia didn't really have a lot of that until much later on, when you do get the Russian Revolution. But, at that point, the Tsar had so much more power. But the people wanted more, and the military sided with them. If the Tsars cannot get the military on their side, they just do not hold power. They don't. because you alienate the military, and they're like, well, we're just gonna put like your brother or your kid or your cousin or someone in charge. If we don't like them, then we're gonna kill them too. Like, that's how they did it. It worked for them, but so it's very interesting. Yeah, the Napoleonic Wars were a huge influence on Russia too, because you do see a massive invasion of Russia, and this is the first time Russia really has to deal with a formidable Western force invading a proper Russia, whereas they had dealt with invasions and things before. It was always, so much earlier on, and militaries are very different, warfare is very different, and they were not usually large organized offensives the way that Napoleon's was. So it really sort of forced a change in Russia of strategic thought and military thought, and the military did see a lot of what Napoleon was doing and did learn a lot from it. And when the emperor there didn't want to enact those changes, they just got rid of them and put somebody else in who did, and so they got their changes, which was vital in growing Russian military strength, even though it would not prove to be a whole lot in the next couple of wars that come up. But between the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War and others, they were not really winning, but they did have a modernized military. So yeah, that's another thing I really wanted to bring up, is just how Napoleon really did change. Napoleon changed Europe as a whole, and changing Russia like that. I think part of that had to do with that Russia was trying to be more European, and so they were, like the rest of Europe, trying to adapt to the new world that Napoleon had created, instead of withdrawing and taking on more of their Eastern influences for the way that they could have. So it's very interesting. I love these videos; they're really good. These Russian ones are very interesting. So I'm very interested in Russian history. But I'm gonna go ahead and end the video there. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos you'd like me to check out, please put in the comment section. As I said, I have already done parts 1 and 2. They will be in the link in the description. I've also already done the 1917 Russian Revolution, so I'll put that down there too, so you can check that out. And I will be doing the rest of the series very soon. I will be continuing the Napoleon series as well, by Epic History TV, because that is also amazing. So on that note, I will see you next time.